following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. One of my fondest memories is one of my fondest boyhood memories was running down to the corner drugstore every spring to purchase my first pack of baseball cards. They cost a nickel a pack and included 10 trading cards, a stick of bazooka bubble gum, and sometimes something extra, like a team sticker or a coin with a player's photo on it. Collecting those cards became a summer-long ritual. Since they were released in several series over the course of the baseball season, I was always trying to scrape together the change to make sure I'd have all the 400-some cards by the season's end. I'd anxiously flip through each pack hoping to find a Philly. In fact, Richie Allen became my first big league hero because his 1965 card was the first one I discovered between the waxed paper wrappers. While other kids traded their cards or clipped them to their bicycle spokes with clothespins in order to make a pinwheel sound, I hoarded mine. As I grew older, I became an authority on the starting lineups of the National League teams because of the hitting and pitching statistics on the back of each card. I'd sit in front of the TV with my Phillies cards in one hand and the opposing teams in the other, trying to recreate, if not manage, the game. It was the early 1970s, and the Phillies were terrible, except for Steve Carlton, a former St. Louis Cardinal whose first Topps card in a Phillies uniform appeared in 1972 with "Traded" in bold capital black letters across the front. Lefty went 27-10 that year, winning nearly half the 59 victories the Phillies had that season. By 1980, when Mike Schmidt, my last and greatest hero, led the Phillies to their first world championship, I had outgrown a cherished hobby of my youth. I packed up all my baseball cards in an old steamer trunk and left them behind in the attic of my parents' house in Northeast Philly. Not until I had a son of my own who also fell hard and fast for baseball did I return to card collecting. No longer was it a hobby as much as a bond between generations. I'm sure many listeners experienced the very same rite of passage. Well, if you're planning a trip to Cooperstown, New York this summer, you will have an opportunity to relive that experience at the Baseball Hall of Fame, where a new exhibit titled Shoebox Treasures is on display. John Odell, Curator of History and Research at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, is here with us to tell us more about the exhibit as well as about some of the rewards and challenges he experienced assembling it. Welcome back to the podcast, John. It's great to have you on again. How's the summer going up there in Cooperstown?
Hey, Bill, it's going really well. We had a terrific induction weekend that we've just finished, and that we're all kind of recuperating from. But boy, oh boy, did we have a boatload of folks coming east from Washington, Seattle, Washington, and lots of New Yorkers, of course. But then the Philly contingent for Roy Halladay was pretty strong as well. So we had a whole bunch of folks here. I think the number they've kicked around is about 50,000, and for a village of 1,800, that's pretty good work. And we had a lot of folks coming through the museum and through the exhibit, Shoebox Treasures. So all has been really quite good.
Yeah, it's amazing. The Cooperstown really pulls out all stops, every summer for that celebration. I've been there about half a dozen times. I didn't make it up this year. I was out in Pittsburgh watching the Pirates and the Phillies over that weekend. But yes, it was a big weekend for Phillies fans. As not only was Roy Halladay inducted, but our very own Jason Stark.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Started with the Philadelphia Inquirer, was also the Ford Frick winner. So that was a big plus for Philadelphians that went up there. You heard about my experience. I'm sure, over the years I talked to you about my love of baseball as well as cards. Did you have a similar experience with baseball cards as a kid?
So I was a similar experience, but not quite the same, and I'm sure that everybody had their own. We didn't have a lot of collectors on our in my block, and so most of my friends weren't card collectors. I would occasionally go pick up baseball cards, and so enjoyed doing that. But I often found that I'd rather go ahead and buy a Slurpee with that same money than buy baseball cards in the summertime of Tidewater, Virginia, where I grew up. So, but I did. As a matter of fact, one of my first cards was of a Philadelphia Philly named Cookie Rojas. And the great second baseman who later went on over to Kansas City, was an all-star, and I just loved the idea that a fella named Cookie with horn-rimmed glasses could make it big in the majors. I thought that was pretty neat. So he became my first. He was who knows how many, when you get a pack of cards, which is your first card? That's the first one I remember. And collected occasionally over then. Really loved the 71 black borders. That was the year that was one of the years that I was really active in it, and the design of the cards really prompted me to want to get more, and it was a year when I just was totally into it, and then some a little bit more before and after that, but that's kind of my story. And so when I was doing the research for this exhibit, it was a lot of fun for me to go back and relive those experiences, but also to tap into and learn the experiences of other collectors so that we could collate those things and bring them together into a conversation there in the exhibit space.
Boy, did you take me back. You must have gotten your baseball cards, I know your Slurpees, at the 7-Eleven, correct?
That's exactly right, yes.
And those Slurpee cups, by the way, in the 70s, also had baseball players on them, if I remember
that sure
correctly.
Did. They sure did.
I still have a bunch of them sitting around somewhere. The Cookie Rojas was interesting, too. Very interesting individual, not only for those horn-rimmed glasses and named Cookie, but as I learned this morning, another interesting figure facially was Don Mossy, who passed away, sadly, at age 90, I heard yesterday.
Oh, my goodness.
But Mossy is largely considered the ugliest man ever to play Major League Baseball. In fact, Bill James once said that Don Mossy threw ugly, ran ugly, and hit ugly. He did everything ugly.
Yeah, that's right. I think I recall that he was a 5 ugly player.
Yes, that's right. Do you have a Mossy in that collection?
Oh, I know we've got Mossies in our collection. Absolutely, no question about it.
Well, listen, I know that the Hall had exhibited its collection of some 145,000 baseball cards before. So how does this exhibit, Shoebox Treasures, differ?
Well, it differs in a couple of ways, Bill. One of them is that in doing our research, we found out that we're actually knocking on about 200,000 baseball cards, and we found that out because, when you go back and look at a lot of older baseball cards and moving out of the ordinary Topps cards, people didn't often realize or didn't always realize that when they were looking at any number of other brands, and I'm thinking, for instance, of exhibit cards and other kinds of off-brand productions, that those were baseball cards too, and so they were miscategorized here at the Baseball Hall of Fame often as portraits. The T3s also, for instance, an old tobacco production that were cabinet card sized, about 5 by 8. Those, and they were special premium cards, and so we simply had those listed as portraits. And so once we started collecting all of these things that are generally recognized by baseball card collectors today as baseball cards, we had increased our our collection by about a third, which is a pretty remarkable thing. Now, the second thing is that when we had our old exhibit, and fans who came to the Cooperstown Baseball Hall of Fame, or the National Baseball Hall of Fame here in Cooperstown, may remember seeing a wall of baseball cards, of a couple of hundred baseball cards just all up against a wall, and without much more than a couple of sentences about these cards were made in this year and these cards were made in this year. And what we wanted to do, we took that exhibit down maybe about a decade ago or so, and immediately heard back from fans saying, hey, we love baseball cards. We'd like to have those baseball cards back up. And we talked about it a little bit here, not a little bit, we talked about it quite a bit, and realized that we wanted to do the same thing, but we wanted to take it another level. And so what we created was a much more in-depth investigation and exploration of the making of baseball cards and the production of baseball cards and the collecting of baseball cards, so that we wanted to talk about their history and where they wove into our American fabric, how they were made and how they were designed, and then how folks on the street, so to speak, going to their to the Wawa or to the 7-Eleven or to the Woolworths reacted when they saw these cards, and how they collected them and stored them and shared them with one another. So it was a much more in-depth look that we wanted to do, something that was a little bit more engaging, hopefully a little bit more relevant, and perhaps evoking more of the feeling of collecting baseball cards than just seeing a couple of cards up on a wall.
Now, you mentioned the tobacco cards, and I'm not sure how many listeners know that the tobacco cards, the first baseball cards, painted images and later photographs, began in the 19th century,
right?
Started by tobacco companies to promote their product. We, of course, think of the baseball card collecting as a hobby for youngsters, but did adult males really collect those cards back in the 19th century?
You know, they did, but I think that it's telling that there were two eras of tobacco cards. One of them in the late 1880s up to the very early 1990s, about 5 years then, and then again around 1909 to 1912, 1908, 1912, something like that. And both times the tobacco industry included lots of other cards beyond baseball cards. So they had baseball cards, but they had other athletes, they had actors and actresses. As a matter of fact, for the 19th century and early 20th century, some of the actress cards had the women were rather busty, and they were sort of risque in a very G-rated sort of way today, but they were designed to encourage you to buy more tobacco cards. But the thing that I think is really neat is that looking back, you go, oh, well, for a few years, and then they stopped for about 20, and then did it again for a few years and stopped. I think it demonstrates that adult men were not the primary the adult men didn't buy them enough to make it worth the while. And then a little bit later on, you start getting Cracker Jack cards in 1914 and 15, and then maybe we could talk about this again in a little bit, but the candy cards, and then which eventually led to bubblegum cards and a more child-oriented story. But certainly one of the great stories that we came across when we were doing this was from the around 1910, 1909, 1910, down in Charlotte, North Carolina, where the Charlotte Observer reported that the children were hounding men who smoked cigarettes, asking them for their baseball men. Which was their term that they were using for the baseball cards. So, definitely you see very early on that children, even if they're not the ones who are being targeted with this, are certainly primary consumers of these cards, and I think that's why they endured for so long once the market found the right connection.
That is fascinating that there was a diversity of tobacco cards like that. I thought that type of diversity only came in later, like in the late 80s and 90s, when they started doing, the president cards and
right.
cards of scenes from movies. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
of course, football cards came in earlier,
Sure.
but later than baseball cards. I had no idea of that kind of diversity in tobacco cards. It's interesting to see how cyclical this is. Now, obviously, the most famous tobacco card is the T206 Honus Wagner,
Yes.
designed by the American Tobacco Company. It's widely regarded as the holy grail of baseball cards because so few of them exist. And in fact, I remember about 3 years ago, a T206 Honus Wagner in mint condition sold for a world record price of $3.12 million through Golden Auctions. John, tell us the story behind that card. Why is it so rare? And do you have one of those cards in your exhibit? You do.
That's correct. Yes, we do. We have one of those cards in our exhibit. We have a section of our exhibit called the Holy Grails, and the holiest and grailiest of all of those cards is the Honus Wagner card. And the story behind it is quite interesting. American Tobacco Company issued that card, but apparently they had not gotten, and you had to get the rights back then too, they had not gotten the right to issue that card from Honus Wagner. And so he forced them to withdraw the card and to pull back all of those cards because they had not paid him for the use of his face on the baseball cards. So there are today, and it was recognized very, very early on that this was a particularly rare card from amongst the very earliest of baseball card collectors. There are estimated to be about 60 known cards out there in varying conditions. As you know, Bill, the driving element of these things is not just the supply, because there are a lot of cards that really are pretty rare, but nobody cares about them. But it's the demand and then the condition of the card. So the $3 million card, the Honus Wagner card, was in very extraordinary condition. But even the worst condition cards go for six figures, which is just remarkable. And the Honus Wagner card is definitely at whatever condition level you're talking about, it's always the most expensive card.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if Honus Wagner would resent that fact today, or maybe go and try to find his own card, because $3.12 million, that's more than he could have ever even imagined.
I know it, yeah.
His life. Amazing.
Him, you, and me both, right?
That's right, absolutely. John, you mentioned that the candy companies began to produce baseball cards, I guess, in the 1920s. There was the American Caramel Company, Yingling's Ice Cream, and Willard's Chocolate Company among them. Yeah. How did that evolve from your story about Charlotte and the kids bugging these men for their baseball cards?
Yeah, there was also a Philadelphia Caramel Company which also issued baseball cards as the American Caramel Company did. They were down at where Penn Treaty Park is now, when that was an industrial area. But these candy companies started doing it for the very same reason that the tobacco companies did, and it was to find one inexpensive way to differentiate their particular product from another product and give it enough of a boost that you might that you might pick their candy over somebody else's, and do so, trying to create something that was almost, that cost very, very little to create, but which might improve sales, in a disproportionate way. And so when I think that we don't have documentation on this, obviously, because all of these are private companies, but I think they look back and they said, hey, you remember that about 10 years ago, all these tobacco companies had these baseball cards, and everybody liked them a lot, and the kids seemed to especially like them. Why don't we try doing them? And a lot of those cards, you won't be surprised if you start looking at these candy company cards. They look almost identical to the tobacco company cards. That they really just stole in a lot of ways the look of those cards. They didn't do much in the way of redesigning them, and so the manufacturing process looks the same. The design looks the same, and if you don't look at the back, you can often not tell the difference between a tobacco card and a candy company card. So it seems to be pretty clear that the candy companies just said, "Hey, let's see if we can't use that same technique for our penny candy, and see if we can encourage. Everybody loves baseball. Let's see if we can encourage the kids to buy our candy." And I think it worked really well, because we see it morphing from the caramel and candy companies over to the gum companies. Most notably, perhaps Bowman Gum. They're out of Philadelphia, and that really launched, especially after World War II, launched us on the kind of baseball card story that we know today.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned Bowman, the Philadelphia-based company. There were others, earlier one, which is Gowdy, my favorite card, because of the colorful hand-painted images of the greatest stars of the 30s. But by the early 1950s, these cards were really becoming extremely popular, and they moved away from the advertising back of the earlier tobacco cards and the ice cream cards and the caramel cards to the statistics of the players. And Topps Chewing Gum Company entered the market in the 50s. They would eventually corner it by establishing a monopoly. How did they do that, John?
Well, I like that you're a fan of the Gowdy cards. They are really, truly good-looking cards. They're really attractive-looking cards, and they are a great example of how companies were trying to figure out what's the best way to make the most realistic-looking cards possible. And they're great artwork, and they're bright and they're colorful and they're engaging. And then they start trying to figure out, hey, is a black and white photograph better than color art? And you see this tension going on back and forth over these next couple of years. Topps in 1951 issued its first set. 52 is kind of like the famous set. 51 was just a baseball game with black and white pictures on it, and red or blue backs, or I think that's right. But the 52 set for Topps was just a gorgeous set, which had great imagery, and just the design was great. It was about almost 50% bigger than their previous card set, and they really went head to head with Bowman that year, and it was a real war going on between those two companies. You asked, how did they create this monopoly? And when you go back, it's very interesting to see different players. Some players would sign exclusive contracts with one or the other. Some would sign non-exclusive, so they were with both companies. The thing that's interesting is that Bowman actually had more exclusive contracts with players than Topps did, and so had more players under contract, had more players in their sets. But I think when we look at it, that the only thing that we can figure out, and we spent a lot of hours talking about this, is that the marketplace simply decided, and that people liked the Topps look better than the Bowman looks over the course of the years. That even when Bowman came out, I think it was in '55, with the color TV set Bowman cards, that the Topps cards were just more engaging. Topps came out the very first with the tabular statistics on the back. Before that, they had been, they'd be woven into a paragraph. But here, with Topps, you could see the first couple of years it was just like last year and lifetime, but then soon they began adding in, every single year that the player played, and you got a chance to really see the rise and fall of a player, and you could compare stats with one another. And they were, long before there was anything like the internet or even the baseball encyclopedia, this was where you could find out, last year's and all the years before stats. And I think that was one of the things that helped people decide, hey, I love baseball cards and I want to have them, and I'm getting the Topps.
You mentioned the back and forth between the color, the painted cards, as opposed to the actual photographs, and this is somewhat of a kind of tension. It's kind of morphed into the 3D, really embellished cards that are coming out these days. I mean, geez, when we were kids, I remember it was just, a plain color photograph on a card. There was no real embellishment, but, the cards that are coming out today, and particularly in the late 1990s into the 2000s, not only glossy, but as I said, three-dimensional. Some of these cards had little swatches of players' uniforms on them. Unbelievable stuff. And yet, as I know from a friend, Dick Perez, who used to be the Hall of Fame official Hall of Fame artist, that even his sports art was largely associated with Diamond Kings and the paintings that he did for them. So it's interesting how this these cycles come about. You also mentioned the 52 Topps and Mickey Mantle. The Mickey Mantle 52 Topps card is another holy grail. It's a must-have for collectors because it's so rare.
Right.
And, of course, your exhibit has one of those, too. Why is the 52 Mantle so rare?
So the 52 Mantle has its own very interesting story. It's a higher numbered card, and Topps was issuing cards in series even at that time, and so you couldn't go out on opening day, so to speak, and buy the entire setup just by buying enough cards. That they were over the course of the summertime, in order to promote a longer period of purchasing and more purchasing. You'd have later new cards would be issued later as the season wore on, and Mickey Mantle in the 52 Topps was part of that last set of cards that was issued, and the problem with issuing them at the end is that as the summer wears on, a lot of teams fall out of contention, and their fans lose their enthusiasm for the game, perhaps, and for collecting cards, and it starts to get time to get ready for school, and so they're not buying cards as much any longer. And so Topps ended up with a large number of unsold 1952 cards left over at the end of the year, which they stored for a number of years. And then later on, when they ran out of space in their warehouse, and remember, nobody was buying old, a couple of year old baseball cards at this time. It's like, you got to have the new ones. And so they offloaded them a number of truckloads onto a barge that then took them out into the Atlantic Ocean and dumped them. And Cy Berger was the designer, along with Bill Gelman, Rich Gelman, in 1952, and he talked at length about it's like they just, they had to have this storage space for other things, and so they just had them dumped. So not only did you have not so many cards issued because it was the end, because it didn't happen at the beginning of the season, it happened at the end of the season, but then what was left over got dumped. So that's part of what made the supply low, and then the demand was so high because Mickey Mantle ended up being just like one of the all-time great immortal baseball players, playing for the team of the century, right in the middle of the century when they were at their peak. So you couldn't add too many things together to create the perfect storm for a card to be highly demanded. The last thing is, which I think is kind of funny, the 52 Topps Mickey Mantle is not his rookie card. The 51 from Bowman is his rookie card. That's whenever you say rookie card, it's the first card that a player has that's issued. So that's, you might not be a rookie yourself. In this case, Mantle was, but whatever your first card is your rookie card. And so it was the first one from Topps, but it wasn't his rookie card. But that's the way, the market ended up preferring Topps over Bowman, and so the Topps card is the one that everybody goes for. And of course, the artwork is just without peer. So it's you've got this beautiful image of Mickey Mantle. You're sort of looking up at him. He's got his bat over his shoulder. He's looking over his shoulder, and he's got his nice little signature underneath. And it's just a terrific looking card with that great NY right there on his cap. So it's a very engaging, charismatic card for one of baseball's most charismatic players.
Mm-hmm. John, you mentioned Cy Berger, who really is the godfather of these baseball cards, the marketing expert.
Yeah.
And my assumption is that the approach you just mentioned, why exactly these cards were sold in series, and then how players, if their team, the collectors, if their team was not in contention, they'd lose interest. School was starting, so they didn't have the time, perhaps the discretionary income to purchase these cards. Tell us about Cy Berger. Was he also involved in football cards? I mean, did he realize this same type of approach that you were talking about to collecting and take the concept into other markets? Or
he did, but it goes to the popularity of baseball to tell you why it is that everybody knows about baseball cards from the 1950s and 60s, and football cards even today remain a footnote. There were football cards and later basketball cards that came out, but they have never in any way, shape, or form held a candle really to the size of the marketplace that baseball cards have. Berger was the guy. After the first set of Topps cards came out in 51, Berger, who actually was trained as an accountant, approached the senior management at Topps and said, I think I can do better than that. And so he sat down at his kitchen table and began figuring out what he wanted to do with with the new cards, and it was that was kind of what was that was the way it went. He figured it out, and then the thing that was really interesting was that he was a terrific salesman. That is, Berger was, and he was the one who figured out that if you become a good friend to all of these baseball players, and you make sure that they get the cards that they need. He was the guy who started off in the minor leagues, figuring out that if you give a minor leaguer a $5 check for signing up, saying that if you make it to the majors, then you'll get $100 when we issue your baseball card. Here was a nominal way of securing all of the minor leaguers, and this is what he did, was secured basically all of the minor leaguers to exclusive contracts with Topps once they became major leaguers, and that's one of the things that made it so hard for anybody else to break into the marketplace, because he'd already been paying, they called it stake money, back when you could buy a $5 steak at a restaurant, and here was the only guy who cared at all about minor leaguers coming around and saying, hey, we think that you got a chance of making it to the majors, and here's a check for $5 if you'll sign with us right now, and that's how it worked. And a lot of the guys ended up not needing that $5 check. We actually have one in our own collection here. But that's how it got started, and then later on, you made a little bit more money, and everybody was treated the same with Topps. So, if you were the 26th man on a roster, but you managed to get a baseball card, you got the same $100 that Willie Mays got.
That's a great story. Berger was not the only baseball card personality. You mentioned in the exhibit the Topps photographer, Doug McWilliams. What can you tell us about him?
Yeah, in the 1970s, it was Topps photographer, or at this time just professional photographer Doug McWilliams was shooting already out on the West Coast. He was already a professional photographer, but he got a chance to know Vida Blue, and Vida Blue needed to get some approached Doug, and I've forgotten how they got in contact with one another, but it's because Doug was located in the Oakland area and doing photography out there, and Blue had seen some work that he had done, and asked McWilliams if he could have some cards made up, and Williams figured he was talking about maybe 100 or something like that, and Blue said, no, I get hundreds of requests a day for people asking for my autograph. I want to give them a card that I could sign and turn around really quickly, and so that was how he got involved in first got involved in shooting baseball, and then Topps saw some of his work. The Cy Berger saw some of his work and contacted him and asked if he wanted to work for Topps, and so for the next 24 years or so, every spring training down in Arizona, Doug McWilliams went down and shot all of the teams, and then continued shooting them. There was also some live action shooting that you would do during the course of the season, especially to be able to pick up recent call ups and guys who were traded. So he worked for Topps for 25 years. There's a neat story about he was out photographing one spring training, and the other younger photographers were like totally ready just to pack it in. They were done, but they looked over it, and McWilliams was still working. It's like they realized they couldn't leave and go to the hotel and go to the pool if the old man, as they said, if the old man was still working. So it tells a little bit about how his work ethic also was one of the things that distinguished him. And he donated to us, the Baseball Hall of Fame, the camera that he used during that time, a vest with all of his credentials on it from that era, and about 10,000 of his own photographs that he took, also a baseball player. So he was shooting, in addition to shooting for Topps, he was also shooting freelance, and so he kept those two elements very separate. He would shoot players at different times so that it was not he wasn't really piggybacking one on the other. They were two separate careers for him, but he was just a terrific photographer. Classically trained, went to photography school, so he wasn't just doing snapshots. He had a medium format camera that only professionals use. So it's kind of neat. He talked a little bit about the images that he took. He said the images that he took were so much higher in quality that it took 20 years until 1989 in the upper deck cards, which finally came out in those sharp, good images, high quality printing process before the cards even began to approach the quality of the original negatives.
Now, you suggested a conflict of interest there, not with Doug McWilliams so much as with Vida Blue. Either he never signed a minor league contract or got the $5 check from Berger, or he had an agreement with Berger that he could go and have his own baseball card done by McWilliams.
Yeah. So long as you weren't the thing was you couldn't go to another company which would then sell your card with gum, and that was kind of the key. Topps had the monopoly of selling with gum and without gum. So all these other companies then ended up using like in 1980 the courts ruled against Topps, said they had a monopoly. They had to open it up, and Fleer and Donruss came in first, and Fleer and Donruss first issued their cards with gum, and Topps said, no, you can't do that. So Fleer started adding stickers. Donruss added little puzzle pieces. So you had to have something of value with your cards that you were issuing, but it couldn't be gum, and it couldn't be nothing. So there was this kind of a crazy thing that Topps felt like they had gotten both ends of the market closed off, but the court said, yeah, you've moved a little too far, and so opened it up. And of course, the beginning of the 1980s began a whole new level and a whole new era of collecting, and changed the entirety of collecting. When you have three companies instead of one, suddenly it becomes very, very difficult to have complete sets. And it certainly changed the face of baseball card collecting.
And that verdict also opened the market to basically a full-blown industry. I mean, This used to be a childhood hobby, and now, I mean, I sometimes coach little leaguers at baseball camps, and these kids, they don't really trade cards. They have their parents or they themselves will go out and buy the full series, which I think just went on sale at Target because I bought my full series for this year, the full box, and some of them don't even open it. They don't even take the plastic paper off the box itself because, as they tell me, it will devalue the whole series. So we have these little 8, 9, 10-year-old investors at this point, which I kind of think is sad.
Yeah,
but
you
know, I myself, I did purchase the Fleer and the Donruss for about 5-10 years. Then I just do Topps anymore. I just stick with the Topps.
I hear you. Yeah. By the way, when I was talking about Cyberger, Woody Gelman, I knew I was getting the first name wrong. Woody Gelman was his right hand man, was Berger's right hand man, and the two of them together. Gelman was an artistic designer, and the two of them together created a generation of baseball cards that we all know today. And you know, one of the things that's so sad, I think, today about cards is that they're not as distinctive looking as those cards were from the 60s and 70s. When you looked at a card, you could tell with that burlap look that was a 68, or the with the almost psychedelic words across team name across the top that it was a 72. They were just really distinctive looking sets of cards.
And it's sad because now you feel almost that the card companies are pulling frauds, because I know, for example, that Topps came back with the gray border. I guess it was the 1970 card, maybe 69 card, but they're 2018s, and it just it's a fraud.
Yeah.
You can't have that design. The other thing that I think, I don't know if Topps did, I think Donruss might have done it, they put the stars of today in 19th century uniforms. Yeah, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work, and I think in some ways it just cheapens the hobby. But hey, listen, this has been wonderful. You've given us some real great insight. I mean, I learned a lot. There's a lot I did not know about cards that I thought I knew, and I really encourage folks to come up to Cooperstown and
absolutely.
Treasures.
If you love baseball cards, we actually have a place for you now to come on up and we bring it all the way up to the present. The whole story, doesn't end in '81 when the boom began with the end of the monopoly. It doesn't end. The story didn't end with the bust in the 1990s when the combination of overproduction and the baseball strike sent baseball card values plummeting. It's changed and it's different, but it's still going on today, and we really are excited about welcoming people to Cooperstown to enjoy this little story. And one of the neat things about our exhibit is that you even get a chance to make your own historical baseball card of yourself, which you can email to yourself for free when you once you've made it. So there's a lot to a little takeaway that you can bring with you.
John, one more question for you. Why do baseball cards have this enduring impact? I mean, we talked about the football cards, we talked about the basketball cards that never really caught on, and and there have been times. I mean, really, people were concerned about baseball in the 1990s when the personalities just weren't there, and kids were starting to go over more to soccer in the city. Basketball had become the city game, and yet baseball cards still have that enduring impact. Why is that?
I think that's a mystery, and I don't know. But all I can imagine is that it is woven in with the history of baseball and its tie to our culture and the place that baseball cards have had in it. And maybe some of it is because stats are so much a part of baseball that, every position in baseball, with the exception of pitcher, has the same stats, and all the pitchers have the same stats. You can't do that in football. It's like there's too many specialized things in football, and even in basketball there are different kinds of players who have different things that they do. But baseball, in a unique way, the front lets you see what the guy looks like. The back tells you a little biographical sketch about who he is, and then the numbers don't lie. And there you go in black and white. This guy's either a journeyman, he's a great, or he's a future, an average guy. He's an all-star, he's a future Hall of Famer. You just, and lots of debates to go along with that. But I think it's all tied into this tactile element of being able to, as you were talking about earlier, having those cards in your hand and being able to enjoy them in a way that, even though MLB has got its bunt package now, and Topps has its bunt package, it's not MLB, it's got Topps has its bunt package. You can collect baseball cards on your cell phone, but it's just not the same.
It isn't. It just isn't. We've been speaking with John Odell, the lead curator for the Hall of Fame's new baseball card exhibit titled Shoebox Treasures. I encourage you to visit this summer. The museum hours are 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Through the day before Labor Day. And for more information, call the Hall of Fame at area code 607-547-7200. John, thanks for being with us again and for the wonderful work that you and all the staff at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Library do in preserving baseball and America's past.
Hey, listen, Bill, thank you very much for inviting me.
And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.